The first thing that I thought you guys might like to see, if I can turn this thing on, is what I looked like in 1971. Now, some people say, I'm going to try to do this without notes, so if I get completely screwed up, I'll go to my notes. Some people say I look like Herman's Hermit. It looks like it's a Yardbirds album cover, maybe, right? But this is what 35 years in architecture does to you, right? And so you know what they say now? They say, you look like George Bush. In fact, do I look like George Bush? I was on a flight from Washington to San Francisco last year, and I was sort of dozing, and the flight attendant comes over and she says, Mr. President. Mr. President, is that you, Mr. President? And I just looked up and I said, yes, it is. Leave me alone. And later on, I got a bottle of champagne sitting at so that was pretty cool. So I've got lots of George Bush stories. My real claim to fame, though, is in 1971, I won the LIT first photo contest. And I was 19 at the time. And I took a picture of my girlfriend. And this is my wife, Iris, when she looks like Jennifer Aniston, doesn't she? She does not look like Barbara Bush, I can tell you that. But it was really weird because I won this thing. I submitted it and I won it, and it was the first time that it was published in color, right? And so all of a sudden it's in color, and there were no women at Lawrence Tech at the time, right? My girlfriend was plastered everywhere. Everywhere I went, it was like Iris was the pinup girl. And I go, this is really weird. I go in the engineering building, there's my wife, and they'd say, you're dating that? They didn't say hot chick at the time. She is really, So Iris has been certainly the most important person in my life, and the one who's really been instrumental in every decision I've made, along with lots of other friends out here too. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So what I want to chat today about people that have been sort of an inspiration in my life, that have mentored me, some clients and some other architects, and some that have been sort of part of a key decision point in my life. And the first person is this guy. Do you know him? Art Smith. Can you imagine anybody that has a taste in sweaters like this being a mentor? I mean, look at that red turtleneck on this guy. But I met Art in 1983, and 1983, right? 84. And I was working at General Motors Corporation at the time, and I had worked at Lou Redstone, and then I went to GM, and I really was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, whether I wanted to stay as a corporate architect. And Art started getting involved in the project. It was called General Motors Acceptance Corporation up in Bloomfield Hills. First time that we had brought an architect in from the outside to do interiors work. And Art was the chief designer at Newman Smith at the time. And so Art and I developed a relationship, and we were sort of designing side by side, but a lot of it was Art's ideas. And Art just kept pushing me and pushing me and pushing me, and he had this idea. He used to call them these pink zooty columns that would splash water into the air, and I'm thinking to myself, I've got to go back to the president of GMAC and tell them that we're proposing pink zooty columns that splash water in the air. And but Art pushed and pushed and pushed. And I don't think Art really knew it, but at the time I was trying to figure out, again, what I wanted to do, and Art became a really important part of that. The passion for design, the way that you pushed really made me understand that it was time for me to move on. And you were an instrumental part of that. You were part of the decision process that I was going through to move to California. And I did. And Art, you've been an important part of my life for a long time. He also sponsored me for my FAIA. I wasn't even thinking of it. He's like, you ever have a mentor that's younger than you? They are a pain in the butt, right? And he kept calling me and saying, you got to do the FAA, I got to do it. And he's been the catalyst in that, so he's been a real important part of my life over the years. So when I moved to California, one of the first things I did, I had a chance to meet and work with this guy. Do you know who this guy is? Yeah. Steve Jobs. And I met Steve through a friend of mine. His name was Tom Carlisle. Tom was working at Apple. And Steve had got thrown out of Apple. Remember? Steve got thrown out. And then Tom got thrown out. He was sort of Steve's right-hand guy. And Tom said to me one day, he was a connection to another friend. He said, "Do you want to interview at Next Corporation for the new corporate headquarters?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love to do that." And he said, "Well, Steve's going to set up some interviews." And I said, "Great, just tell me when." And I'm pulling together the whole team and everything. And he says to me, "I got the interview set up." I said, "Okay, great. What do we, I'm bringing the whole team." And he said, "No, Steve wants to talk to just you." I said, "Me? I'm going to go in and interview with Steve Jobs." Steve was 33 at the time, and I'm 37, right? So I go in, and I'll never forget. I mean, Steve, sitting in this conference room, and Steve's sitting there, and he comes in dressed in blue jeans and sneakers and the black top and everything, and he's eating a pita bread sandwich, and the French dressing's like dripping down his chin, right? And I'm thinking, this guy is worth $1 billion, And I'm going through my whole spiel about architecture and everything else, and about the Worcester. I was working at Worcester Pottery at the time, and why they should hire us. And Steve says, "Stop." He said, "I don't want to hear any of that." He said, "Why should I hire you?" And I said, "Well, I was really at a loss. I mean, I really didn't know what to say. I mean, I was really nervous. I'm intimidated by this guy." And he says, "Why should I hire you?" I'm trying to think, what the hell do I say? And I said, "Because I'm the best damn architect in the Bay Area. And I'd love to work with you because I think the work that you did at Apple was extraordinary." And he sort of sat there eating his pita bread sandwich, and then he stopped and he said, "Good reason." He said, "Let's get started right now." And we did. And he hired me on the spot right away. So we ended up, he grabbed me and he took me around the manufacturing facility, showed me the next computer, the black computer, right? It was the first black computer. Frog Design had done the work, and IDEO had done a lot of the work, and Steve was showing me all this stuff. And I thought it was a beautiful machine. He said, "Isn't this thing beautiful?" I said, "It's great." And then he takes off the back of the machine, and he shows me the guts of it, right? And I'm like looking at it, and everything is all lined up, and I'm thinking, why am I looking at all these cards lined up and all the wires perfectly? And he said, "Isn't this beautiful?" And I said, "Yeah, it's beautiful." I said, "But, I said, who's going to see it?" And he said, "The engineers are going to see it. The engineers are going to see this. The engineers are the ones that are going to be moving these cards and working on this." And I thought, oh my God, I've been hired and fired in the first, within like an hour. Because he was mad. He was clearly mad. But I had a chance to work with Steve Jobs. And he would come into the office every Thursday, and he would sit down, we'd clear the office out, and this is for the students out there especially, we would draw. We had CAD and everything else, but we would draw. And we would draw in front of Steve, and we would sketch, and Steve would be there. And then occasionally we'd go over to Chow and have dinner together. And this is the project that we did. This is 80. I actually took these from some old photographs, but I wanted to show you. This was 80. This is 27 years ago, right? And it won my first AIA award working with Steve. And he had this idea. Steve was such an extraordinary person. Everything about Steve was the way it functioned and the way it looked. Right? The way it functioned and the way it looked. The two were all they were melded together. And I remember Steve said, what I want to do, like now we talk about, I don't know, folks that are architects here know that we talk about collaborative spaces and getting people to meet together and cafes and all this kind of stuff. This is 87. And Steve said, we got to have a hearth. We got to have a hearth. I want all my engineers that come out of offices, they can gather around the hearth, and we're going to have this cafe, and we're going to have a main street. And I got to get them out of the offices because they tend to be heads down, and these were ideas that everybody's doing now. And there were this whole sort of main street with restrooms and everything else. And this whole sort of topic with Steve of anything is possible. I'll just tell another quick little story. So he says to me, in order to really make this work, I don't want to have any bathrooms on the second floor. And I said, Steve, you can't not have bathrooms on the second floor. That doesn't meet code. He said, He said, not only do I don't want bathrooms, I don't want elevators in this either. Because I want everybody to go down the stairs, go to the bathroom, get out of their office, go down the stairs, run into one another in the stair, go in the restroom, run one another in the restroom, go in the cafe, have a cup of coffee or whatever. I'm going to force them to do this. And he said, you go down to the city of Redwood City and you get this approved. I thought, what is my argument for a variance on no restrooms, right? And I went down there and we were laughed at, right? Tom Carlisle and I went down and we got laughed at, and we came back and I said to Steve, we didn't get it approved. And he said, do I? He was really crazy at times, but he said, do I have to do everything myself? And so he said, you set up a meeting. And he went, I swear to God, we went down there. He called, somehow the mayor got involved. We go down there, Steve goes in. I didn't have quite the power that Steve had, right? And he said, either you grant me these variances or I'm moving my corporate headquarters to somewhere else, because this is fundamental to my business. The interaction of engineers and designers and everybody else is fundamental to my business, and I'm not having restrooms on the second floor. And there were no restrooms on the second floor. None. And this is a stair. And I could tell you look how thin that stair is. Yeah. Look how thin the concrete is, right? I told Steve that this stair could not be built, and he ripped me one. And he got, at the time, I.M. Pei was doing his apartment building in New York, and he said, I said, I'm getting a real architect in here. I'm going to get I.M. Pei's chief architect in here to show you how to build this stair. And this stair got built, right? So you never said no to Steve at all. You never said it can't be done. Shortly after working with Steve, I don't even think my dad knows this, right? I had a chance to work with George Lucas. Not as closely as Steve, but George was building a project up in Marin County called Big Rock, and it had been in planning for like 30 years, and we never got it approved, and we ended up getting hired as the architect. And the one thing I learned from George is this whole idea of storytelling, and the idea that you bring your audience sort of into a project, and you're not selling a building, you're selling an idea. You may be selling a vision idea and a philosophy or something. And so we sort of latched onto that when we started on the project. And George, we said, well, why we can't get this office building approved in Marin County? Maybe it isn't an office building. Maybe it isn't something else. So he storyboarded this whole thing about it being a young man from the Midwest, Chicago, that went to the West Coast, who ended up, making it big and technology, and he longed for, his roots in Chicago, and he hired Frank Lloyd Wright to build his house in this 3,000 acres of land in Marin County. And he went in and presented it that way. Never used the word office building, never talked about parking or any of that kind of stuff. And the Board of Supervisors, after 30 years, and that was a presentation that we gave, they approved it. And this is a project that we did. And it sits, I don't have a lot of photographs of these things, but it sits on over 1,000 acres, a couple thousand acres. It's quite a bit off the road. And when you actually look at it, it looks like a house. It looks like a house on a ranch. And what's interesting about, George and Steve were in the same mindset. When it came to design, nothing was compromised. And George loved historic architecture, whereas Steve was clearly a modernist, right? But, you got 1,000 acres here, and George refused to have any parking that could be seen. All the parking is underground, which is pretty amazing. And so I had a delightful time working on this project. Although I'll tell you, this may go too long, I can tell. I'm going to talk too much. His chief financial officer, we lost a lot of money on the project. His chief financial officer, I used to go in and argue ad services with him. He had 2 tears tattooed on his. And so every time I go in, all I could stare was at those little tears like he was. I thought, I'm not going to get any money from this guy at all. But so this is a shot of the entry. There's Yoda, right? He did everything. Same time that we worked on that, the project up in Marin, right about the same time, George came to us and said, I have this project in the Presidio. It's an international design competition. I want you guys as our design architect. And I had never competed with any international firm, ever. I didn't, we were big as Gensler is or was at the time. We're a local firm in San Francisco. So we would never have been the design architect on this, but George wanted us. And we storyboarded the thing the same way. It was about, this is actually in the Presidio. It's probably the most valuable piece of property in the world, and it was the old Presidio Armory base that was being turned back to the Presidio Trust, and they needed one project that was going to generate income to pay for the operations and maintenance of the entire Presidio. So in essence, it's an office building. But George never described it as an office building. We storyboarded it, this idea about a bunch of digital artists from LA who were tired of the LA lifestyle, who came up to San Francisco. They established their roots and they developed this digital arts campus in this beautiful site, this old military base with this great historic architecture. And the Presidio Trust, partially because it was George, but I think it was really more about what the project was all about rather than a spec office building, right? Which really was a spec office building. And it's partially occupied by Lucas, but only partially. The other part of it is being rented. And it was a wonderful project, and I had a chance to work with Larry Halprin, the great landscape architect. Right before Larry passed away recently, Larry was involved. But it's a completely open campus, and what's interesting about this is that there's almost 1,200 cars, and do you see any of them? They're all underground in this hillside. And all these buildings sit on a parking podium, and there is a huge underground infrastructure, and George didn't want to see a car. He thought there were no cars that would be appropriate in the Presidio. And it's a beautiful project in the way that it works with the existing architecture. It's one of my favorites. I happen to be a modernist, but I also love all sorts of architecture, and this is one of the best. And then, again, there's Yoda, right? He's everywhere.